On The Nation this morning, in America and Britain, they're the newest, best idea from centre-right political parties. Charter schools, private schools without the fees. And now they're here, but can they boost academic performance in our poorer suburbs?
With no requirements imposed upon the schools, they can effectively do what they like.
The largely taxpayer-funded schools will be tested in South Auckland and Christchurch, with private business, religious, iwi and community groups encouraged to run and partly finance them. It's all part of the confidence and supply deal between National and ACT, but teacher unions oppose the schools. They say the government has no mandate for them. That's partly because of talk about performance pay, concerns about an already resource-strapped state education sector, and the view that educational choice already exists with private and integrated schools. But a few do see charter schools as having potentially a huge benefit.
Well, I think a partnership with a business that was prepared to take on some social responsibility by helping us with resource can leave the schools to do the things that they do very well, and that's educate.
When it comes to the success of the charter school model in the US and Britain, reports are mixed, but the movement's growing in the US, with more than 2 million students now attending the tax-supported schools. So this morning we look at the pros and cons of a charter system with would-be providers and principals for and against the plan. You're back with The Nation. Well, when John Banks and John Key made their surprise announcement this week to trial charter schools in lower socio-economic areas, talk of any potential benefits were quickly overtaken by criticisms. The trial is part of ACT's confidence and supply support deal with National, and the new, largely state-funded but independently run schools will be introduced to South Auckland and Christchurch within the next 3 years. Labor and teacher unions have condemned the plans as a step towards privatising the education system, which neither National nor ACT campaigned for before the election. The NZEI claims that charter schools can take students and money away from existing schools, are less accountable, undermine communities and increase social segregation. But others believe they have definite merits. To debate this, I'm joined now by Greg Fleming, CEO of the Maxim Institute, and Alan Vester, Principal of Pakaranga's Edgewater College and Chairman of the Secondary School Principals Council. Good morning to you both, gentlemen. Greg Fleming, let's start with you. Can you tell us, because the devil will be in the detail, but can you tell people what a charter school is and why it's any different than a state school, an integrated school or a private school?
Yeah, no, great question. Well, we already have 3 types of schooling in New Zealand at the moment, so private, integrated and public. The difference between the first two is that an integrated school receives state operational funding, but the capital assets are owned by the government. Under a charter school that can operate in either model, looking at charter school systems overseas. So you may end up with the government owning the capital of some and not in others, but the same thing will operate in both, and that they will receive that. And for a New Zealand primary school, which is the area that I know best, about $67,000 per year in operational funding.
So the fundamental difference is capital ownership, or the model for capital ownership?
That's between private and integrated, no, but there are other differences as well. So a private school has freedom, and this is where a charter school starts to look a lot more like a private school and within the New Zealand environment. A private school has a lot more freedom than a state or an integrated school does around the delivery of curriculum, even around the recruitment and the compensation of teachers, and around what it wants to focus its school's character and the specifics of its education on. So a charter school system is simply giving that type of freedom that we already see to those that we have already schools, exactly,
in private schools,
and giving it to the 1% of communities who are most struggling, so down the bottom of the demographic scale. That's why I'm so excited about it.
All right. Is that your, Alan, is that your understanding of what a charter school is?
Yes, basically, yeah, that's...
All right. One would ask then, Alan, what's wrong with that?
Good question. My personal view is probably that the solutions that we're looking for under charter schools can be achieved under the system that we're already operating in, the state system in New Zealand, and that the negative possibilities with the charter system that I've sort of observed and read about, we could avoid. So, to me, they're picking up a model that's come from overseas, where the actual private-public system is completely different to what it is here in New Zealand. So, for instance, in the United States, the schools are funded completely differently depending on where they are. And so I could understand why parents would be so keen to get their students into an alternative system. But in New Zealand, where the funding is actually in some way compensatory for poorer communities, I don't think the charter school model has such relevance.
So you are saying no need for chartered schools with the three current options we have of integrated state or private?
I don't believe there's a need for charter schools in New Zealand.
OK. If Alan doesn't believe that, Greg, you better come up with a very good reason why they are going to work and why we need to give parents or students, indeed, fundamentally, a fourth choice.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of reasons. One is, and Alan's mentioned, there are some great examples overseas that we can learn from. And so a report that has been bandied around a lot this week by Robin Duff of the PPTA, and he's been using the report mischievously. It's a report out of Stanford University 2 years ago, put out there by their centre which specialises in education research. And what he's been putting out is the headline, which is that charter schools don't work for the majority of students. However, the devil, like anything, is in the detail. And actually, when you read that report, you'll find that the most exciting part of it is that one of the few consistents across charter schools across the United States, which, as you said earlier, involving about 2 million students, is that the students who come from the poorest areas almost universally do significantly better in charter schools than they do in public school systems.
So you are prepared to say now that you believe that this policy presents an opportunity to improve the educational achievement of people in our students in our lowest socioeconomic areas?
Absolutely, because it's giving them access to the very types of education, it's giving them the choice in schooling that at the moment is only available to the top 1 to 5% of New Zealanders. And for a country that likes with an egalitarian spirit, this is fantastic.
OK, you stand by that. That's where you put your stake in the ground. Alan, do you believe that?
Well, I read the same research, and I probably came to the same conclusion about the ability of those schools to work with the poorest communities. Of course, they actually work negatively for many other communities, so it's for the poorer communities. But again, I stand by the assertion that really that can be done in the state system. If there's something about the charter schools which stands out in the way in which they operate or the way in which they teach, which makes a difference, then I'm not sure why those innovations aren't pushed into the state system. I don't see why you need to set up an alternative system to put in place. One thing we have in New Zealand, which overseas don't have in the same way, certainly in the States, is Education Review Office. And so where schools are seen to be failing, and there are obvious reasons for why those schools are failing, which come from within the school and not from within the community, because that's another issue which I think actually the government wants to avoid.
These schools will be subject, though, I understand, to ERO review.
Well, they would need to be, because that's what Stanford research says, that in the states where they do the least well are the states where there is no review of them. So there's
so there's common ground there. You both agree if there are going to be charter schools, ERO's in there, and it's checking.
The Stanford report actually finishes with a great line where it says that the charter school movement has all been about opening up access, and then it says the challenge is that we've now got to make sure that we open up the exits, because their concern is, their critique is levelled at those schools that are failing and not being shut down. But the great thing in New Zealand is that we have this excellent review process. The challenge in New Zealand, of course, is the exact opposite. Let's actually open up the access. And that's what
in truth, though, Greg, doesn't this simply allow what would otherwise be private schools to access public funding, taxpayer funds? Isn't that really philosophically what this is all about?
Absolutely it is, yeah. But the fantastic thing about it is that because it's operating in these schools, this is making that type of education choice available to those communities. I mean, there's no way that people are going to be able to charge anything more than a token fee on top of it. So these schools are going to be incredibly efficient about the way they deliver that education.
I just still fail to understand why that can't be delivered if the funding's going to be the same.
Sure.
What will be different about a charter school?
Because it's the innovative spirit that you allow into those schools. You allow... No, this is absolutely key. You allow entrepreneurs into that sector. The point is that we see the way that these different schools, these private and integrated schools, perform in New Zealand. We see the incredible popularity. We see the waiting list that they have. Why wouldn't we want to make some of these schools available to those communities at the moment that are shut out?
So you are suggesting to me that there is a whole cohort of brilliant teachers and principals out there who, for some reason, under the current structure, if they were given the money from the same source, taxpayer funds from the same source, but it went through a business or another group and became a charter school, somehow their creative teaching potential would be miraculously unlocked.
I think the research, if we carried on and read the research that we're referring to, in fact it says that if anything in the charter school movement there is a movement towards conformity. So actually they push very heavily the idea that the schools are diverse. The schools are diverse, but the actual within the schools are very uniform, and actually there's a conformity to a very traditional teaching style. So the charter school research isn't showing that schools are more more innovative in their delivery. It's showing what they do, and the one certainly I've observed is put a lot of energy into the basics, a lot of rote learning. The results do actually get better.
Alan, do you have teachers coming to you saying, I would like to be more creative, deliver better to my students, but state education somehow constrains me?
No, not at all. No.
The thing,
Well, Greg...
Sure, OK. Well, one of
that would seem to counter your argument quite strongly.
Well, I'll put it simply like this. If the current system at the moment is able to deliver the sorts of things that we want to see for these most struggling communities in New Zealand, why, after decades of trying, why, after putting more and more money, is it not working? Surely it's not. Surely it's time to actually, let's have a trial at something else. Let's see if there's another way we can do it.
OK, Alan, you are nodding in acceptance,
I mean, you do have to accept that. And I went back to an earlier point, really, which is that to what extent the school and the educational outcomes are actually a cause, or to which extent they're a symptom. And I think what the big questions we avoid talking about are the communities that these are in. On every single social statistic, they're doing badly. It's not that they're doing badly in education and well in health, or well in employment, or well in overcrowding. They're actually doing badly in all of those things. And I think it's a much more systemic approach which is needed in these communities, rather than schools. I get really, really tired of the idea of failing schools. I feel that there may be failing communities, but I don't believe there's too many failing schools.
Alan, it could be said that this policy and the way it's been introduced is a reaction to what some would see as a lack of progress in reform of our education system, our existing education system. I'm wondering, in that regard, would you prefer charter schools or bulk funding, a policy which Nationals had a couple of cracks at and been knocked back every time? It hasn't managed to introduce it. This might be seen as backdoor bulk funding. Would you rather have bulk funding than charter schools?
Well, the school I was in never was a bulk-funded school, and I think one of the prime oppositions to bulk funding, from my perspective, was the fact that it could too easily become bulk underfunding, that it's too easy for the government to put a cap on spending, at which point we can't increase teachers' salaries. Yeah, that's a devil's choice, isn't it, really? Bulk funding or charter schools. That I have a choice, honestly, I couldn't. I'd have to really think carefully about that.
And last question, do you think this is an attempt at payback in some ways for a teacher union group and principals groups which have not been friends of the government that was returned to office, or the National-led government returned to office at the last election? No?
I don't think it's a payback.
All right. And Greg, you wouldn't?
Not at all. No, I think this is a well-considered step forward. I mean, as a think tank, we've worked on education policy more than any other area for the last 10 years, and this is one particular idea that we have consistently pushed. I think that is an idea whose time has come, and I think the trial in these areas, and this is what most delights me, is the fact that they've targeted the 1% of communities in New Zealand that most need it. I think that is inspired, and I'm excited.
Greg, well, you've got your trial. Alan, it seems to me if you could be convinced that the outcomes were good, you'd accept charter schools. So a trial probably isn't a